Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Stuart Marshall, the postdoctoral associate here at the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies, which is sponsoring tonight's event. The center's mission is to offer Civil War education to students here at Virginia Tech, to K through 12 teachers and their students, and to members of the public. We're able to offer most of these programs for free because of the generosity of our donors who share our belief that understanding the Civil War era is more important than ever. You can find out more about our events and programs at our website, civilwar.vt.edu, or find us on Facebook and YouTube. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Paul Quigley is the director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies and the director for the Center of Humanities for Humanities at Virginia Tech. His first book was titled Shifting Grounds, Nationalism and the American South, 1848 to 1865. He's also published edited volumes titled The Civil War and the Transformation of American Citizenship and Reconciliation After Civil Wars, Global Perspectives. He's here tonight to tell us about his exciting new book, which I have right here, The Man Behind the Cane, Preston Brooks, Political Violence and the Road to the Civil War. The book is published by Oxford University Press and is available as of today wherever books are sold. So Dr. Quigley will speak, followed by some discussion with the audience. And you can all just type in your questions at any time using the Q&A button in Zoom. We'll finish up at about 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Let's give Dr. Quigley a virtual round of applause as we welcome him to our screens.
All right. Thank you very much, Stuart. Thanks for hosting tonight, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. Very happy to be here. It's a special day, of course. Star Wars Day is always special. May the 4th be with you all. But this year it's extra special for me because it's the actual publication day for this new book on Preston Brooks. So I'm really pleased to be sharing it with you all on the first day of publication. Um, the first question a lot of people ask when they hear I've written a book about Preston Brooks is who was Preston Brooks? Most people do not know the name or maybe did not before they signed up for the webinar, but many people are familiar with the image up there on your screens on the book cover because Brooks was the South Carolina congressman who achieved instant notoriety for caning the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner in the US Senate chamber in May 1856. And that's really the one thing that catapulted him into the national spotlight, into the pages of the history books. And that is pretty much the only thing that is why we're talking about him 170 years on. And so a big part of my talk tonight is actually going to be just simply introducing you to Preston Brooks. Again, most people don't know too much about him. He makes a really brief sort of cameo appearance in many history books and history classes, and then we move on. And we tend to make a lot of assumptions about a person based on that one thing they did that made them famous, and that's certainly the case with Preston Brooks. So one of the things I want to do is just really get a better feel for who Preston Brooks was, his background, his experiences, and try to understand why he did what he did in May 1856. And it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. That doesn't mean I'm trying to excuse or celebrate the caning or rehabilitate Brooks's reputation or anything like that. But I do think we should try to understand these kinds of acts and the people who carried them out. The other piece of things in the book and in tonight's talk is Brooks's relationship and connection with the bigger politics of the coming of the American Civil War. And I think understanding Brooks's life, but also understanding how different groups of Americans reacted to the caning can really help us understand that question of why the Civil War came, when it did, and how it did. So that's what we've got on the agenda for this evening. But first, of course, everyone wants to hear about the caning, and so that's where we're going to begin. And it was triggered by a speech in the Senate by Senator Charles Sumner, again, the Massachusetts senator at the time. He delivered a very well-known speech, May 19th and 20th, 1856, on the subject of the crime against Kansas. And the background to this is that the US was fighting over whether Kansas should be admitted to the Union as a slaveholding state or a free labor state. And this is the same issue that had been going on for decades at this point. Every time a new state is ready to enter the Union, the big question is it going to allow slavery or not? And in the mid-50s, it's Kansas that they're talking about in these terms. So the speech stretched over 2 days, lasted about 5 hours total. Pretty impressive performance by Sumner, especially because he wrote it all out very carefully, had it typeset, and memorized it word for word, all 112 pages of the speech. That's how important this moment was for Charles Sumner. He knew it was going to be a big speech that called a lot of attention to him. Brooks was there, Preston Brooks was there for part of the speech, so he heard part of Sumner's tirade against the slaveholding South. Sumner, of course, is one of the leading abolitionists of his time, and so he's arguing very firmly against even the idea that slavery could expand legitimately into Kansas, the crime of slavery, as he called it, the sin of slavery. Um, in the process, though, Sumner criticized not only slavery as an institution, as a system of labor, but also criticized the state of South Carolina. And even more specifically than that, he criticized Andrew P. Butler, who was a senator from South Carolina. He was actually absent when Sumner was making his speech, wasn't there to defend himself. But he became a target for Sumner's ire that day. And you can see the quotation up on the screen. Sumner is lobbing various kinds of sexual innuendos at Andrew P. Butler, accusing him of choosing a mistress who, as it turns out, is the harlot slavery. He also accuses slaveholders of sexual impropriety, connecting that to the process of territorial expansion into Kansas. He also lobbed an even more personal insult against Andrew P. Butler. He mocked him for the habit that Butler had developed of spitting excessively while he spoke. And so it wasn't just the abolitionism in the speech, although it was certainly that, but it was also the personal insults against Andrew P. Butler. It was also the targeted criticism of the state of South Carolina that caused many people in the audience to feel Sumner had gone too far. And that did include some Northerners, but especially, of course, Southern slaveholders, and most especially Preston Brooks. The reason he had a particular reason to be outraged that day is that Andrew P. Butler, again, the special target in Sumner's speech, happened to be his father's cousin. So based on this, he decided retaliation, some kind of physical punishment was warranted. So the question is when and how, what kind of punishment is he going to administer against Sumner? Well, the following morning, Brooks waited outside the Capitol building, hoping to intercept Sumner on his way into the Senate. He ran into a friend and fellow congressman there, Henry Alonzo Edmondson, and told Edmondson what he was planning to do. They waited together, hoping to meet Sumner on his way into the Capitol building. However, Sumner had gone in by a different entrance, so they didn't see him. They tried again the next morning, May 22nd. Same story. They didn't see Sumner. He went in a different entrance. Around lunchtime, Brooks decided he couldn't wait any longer. He really needed to do what he wanted to do. And so he went into the Senate chamber, which was adjourning early that day around lunchtime. So this is what the Senate chamber looked like in the 1850s. This is the room Brooks walked into, and it doesn't take too much imagination to understand the stress that Brooks was under that afternoon. He decided to take this great step. He wanted to vindicate his family's reputation, his state's reputation, his own manhood even, and this is the room where he intended to do it. There were still about 20 odd people actually in the Senate, even though it had adjourned. There were a number of senators still there, a number of visitors as well. And of course, Charles Sumner was still there. He was sat at his desk working away. So Brooks strode up to Sumner, very briefly explained what he was doing there and why. and started to lay into Sumner with his cane, blow after blow. He hit him furiously as hard as he possibly could for about a minute and landed about 30 blows in all. For most of this minute, Sumner was taken by complete surprise. He struggled to rise out of his seat. He was trapped under his desk because the desks in the Senate at that time were actually bolted to the floor of the Senate chamber. So eventually, towards the end of the attack, Sumner was able to get up only by wrenching his desk away from the bolts that attached it to the floor. He was able to do that. The attack was already winding down, and by that point, Sumner staggered into the aisle and collapsed unconscious. So people often wonder, why didn't anyone intervene? There were still 20 odd people in the room. And the first reason I think is just because it was over so quickly. You know, a minute isn't very long for people to react in this kind of emergency, unexpected situation. But the other reason, and you can see a little bit of this in the picture here, which isn't 100% accurate in all the details, but does give you a sense of what was going on. In the middle of the picture, you can see another man with a cane, and that was Lawrence Kit, another congressman from South Carolina. And Kit reportedly tried to hold back any bystanders who might have been tempted to intervene. The two senators in the far left of the picture, though, you can kind of get the message that they were not likely to intervene. They didn't seem to particularly object to what Brooks was doing. They were both Democratic senators, Robert Toombs of Georgia, Stephen Douglas of Illinois, so even a northerner, is sympathetic on some level with what Brooks is doing here. There were certainly some people who would have intervened if they could. You can see kind of behind Lawrence Kit, there's a figure of an older man who's being held back. That guy is John Crittenden, who was a kind of moderate senator from Kentucky. He reportedly shouted at one point, "Don't kill him," but couldn't get involved. He was being held back as well. Eventually, a couple of New York congressmen who'd been on the other side of the Senate chamber, they did manage to make it over there to come to Sumner's aid. But really, by then, the assault was over anyway. The cane had shattered into fragments, and Brooks was already finished. So Sumner, as I said, collapsed into the aisle. He was unconscious for a short time. Not surprisingly, given that two of his wounds had reached down to the bone of his skull, and one of those wounds later became infected. And Sumner didn't return until 3 years later to his senatorial duties in 1859. So really, really serious attack. Brooks was tried in the criminal court. He pled guilty. After all, 20 odd people had seen him do it, and he didn't want to deny it really. He was to a large degree proud of what he had done. He was fined $300. The House of Representatives also launched an investigation into the incident. They issued a report. They held a vote on whether to expel Brooks from the House. More than half of the representatives voted yes, let's expel this guy. But that was not enough. It was supposed to be a 2/3 vote required to expel a congressman. In protest, though, even though he didn't get formally expelled, in protest that, the very idea that his peers in Congress could sit in judgment against him like this, Brooks stood up and resigned anyway. Even though he wasn't expelled, he resigned. But then he immediately stood for re-election and was re-elected unanimously, a good sign of the level of support that he enjoyed from his constituents back at home. So that's the caning. And next, I think we all want to know a little bit more about this guy, the perpetrator, the man behind the cane. He was born into a fairly well-to-do slaveholding family in the town of Edgefield, South Carolina. And this picture up here is actually a rebuilt version of his family home, now known as the Brooks Tompkins house. Brooks was born and raised here. And so what I do in the book, in the first few chapters, I tell the story of Brooks's early life and how he got to the point in 1856 where he was in a position to cane Charles Sumner. And that includes his time as a college student at South Carolina College. It's now the University of South Carolina. He was not a model student there, actually. He got into trouble quite a lot for things like skipping class. He was off campus without permission. Apparently, there was a place called Griggs Tavern that he liked to frequent. He also got into more serious trouble for having a fist fight with another student during his second year. But his record reached a new low in 1839. He was right about to graduate. He had done everything he needed to do, just waiting for the ceremonials, when he heard a rumor, which turned out to be false, that his brother, who was now a student at South Carolina College as well, had been locked up in jail and was being mistreated. So what did Preston Brooks do? He grabbed two pistols and went down to the jail to try and sort things out. Not such a bright idea, I'm sure you'll agree. And even though fortunately no one was hurt in that incident, he was expelled from the college. He didn't graduate after all. Well, only a year later, he was at it again with this time with this guy Lewis T. Wigfall, who was another young local guy. Later became quite famous, moved to Texas, became one of the leading fire eater politicians. But in 1840, Wigfall is just a local Edgefield guy. He found himself in a feud actually with Brooks's entire family, and this feud resulted in at least one fist fight, one gunfight, and two duels as well. Now, the first duel was between Wigfall and Preston Brooks's uncle, James P. Carroll. But the second duel was fought between Wigfall and Preston Brooks himself, and this resulted in both men being pretty seriously wounded. Not going to go into the details here. You can read about them in the book, of course, but suffice to say, it was just not a satisfying outcome for anyone. And based on these youthful escapades at college and after, I think it's really tempting to say, okay, this story pretty much writes itself. Brooks was a violent person. He lived in this system where honor culture demanded a violent response to insults, and therefore the caning was inevitable. But what I concluded, researching his early life and connecting that to the context of the times, I concluded it was a bit more complicated than that. And I benefited in doing that from some really amazing books. These up on your screen at the moment, some really good recent books, which all have in common the theme that manhood and honor in the pre-Civil War South were more fluid than you actually might think. So we used to think about honor as dictating behavior of young elite men in a very regimented, very strict way. And in theory it did, but in practice it was always more complicated. And so what I found with Brooks, which was similar to other men studied in these books, is that Brooks was always trying to figure out what exactly he was supposed to be doing as far as honor and manhood and these kinds of social expectations were concerned. He wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to act as an honorable man in these violent incidents as well as in every other aspect of his life. But he was often confused about exactly what that meant he should do. And he often felt like he was falling short, honestly. But despite these violent incidents in his younger years, those were really only a few days of his life. And most of the time, Brooks was living a pretty ordinary life for a man of his social class in that time and place. So in his 20s, he settled into the life of a planter like his father before him, claiming ownership of several dozen enslaved people. He was admitted to the bar, became a lawyer. Not having a college degree wasn't as big an obstacle back then, I guess. He was also elected to the South Carolina legislature. At the same time, again in his 20s into his early 30s, he was also building a family with his wife and their eventual five children as well. But their lives were disrupted, and particularly his life, by news of the war between the United States and Mexico, which broke out in 1846. And like many men in his area and really across the country, Preston Brooks was very keen to do his bit. He volunteered. He was selected to be captain of one of the companies in the South Carolina Volunteer Regiment, the Palmetto Regiment, as it was called. And off he went to Mexico with thousands of other American men. And based on what you've heard so far, he's got this rather pugnacious disposition. So you can imagine Brooks is especially eager to make his mark. However, it turned into a disappointing experience because before he got the chance to do much real fighting, he came down with typhoid fever, became extremely ill, and was sent back home to Edgefield to recover. And for a man like Preston Brooks, it was not easy to stay at home recovering from an illness while everyone else was back in Mexico fighting the enemy and earning military glory. What made it even worse for Preston Brooks is that his brother, Whitfield Brooks Jr., was killed in action at the Battle of Churubusco, which is represented in this picture on your screen. I don't think it's 100% accurate to what actually happened in the battle, but that's what it's supposed to be. So his brother is killed, and you can begin to imagine Preston's feelings at this time. You know, on the one hand, the loss of his brother, that's devastating for Preston Brooks and the rest of the family. But what made it even worse for him is the fact that now there's this contrast between his failure to contribute meaningfully to the war effort. It looked much worse in contrast with his brother's sacrifice of his life, fighting the enemy, winning glory for the United States. So Preston Brooks, he was already determined that he wanted to make it back to Mexico and really get involved in the war and make a name for himself on the battlefield. Now, even more so, he really wants that opportunity. But by the time he gets back to Mexico, the war is pretty much over, and he does not have that opportunity to achieve military glory in Mexico. So this is where I think this is one of the big payoffs of looking at Preston Brooks and digging quite deeply into his life before 1856, because more than any other experience for me, this Mexican-American War experience explains why he did what he did to Charles Sumner. It's the legacy of the Mexican War, the deep disappointment in himself, the sense of failure, frustrated masculinity. All of that helped propel him toward that cathartic act of violence against Charles Sumner in 1856. I also learned quite a lot from some of the archival sources I was able to consult at the University of South Carolina. There's a Preston Brooks collection of archival materials, including there's a small notebook which is titled Extracts from the Diary of My Husband for the Children. Now, the whole time I was researching this book, I was hoping that the actual diary would come to light. Nobody seems to know where it is, and that continues to be the case. So I never found the actual diary, but this was the next best thing. And of course, you take everything with a pinch of salt in a book that's been copied out by the widow of a man after he's died with the stated goal of memorializing her husband for the children. So take everything with a pinch of salt, but these diary entries really do represent some of the best glimpses we have into Preston Brooks's inner life. And one of the things that really is striking is the importance of religion to the way he saw the world. And religion was notably pretty absent from his public life. He didn't make a big deal of religion in his political speeches or anything like that. But you can see from this first quotation up there that he's got this sense of himself as a sinner. He's putting his faith in his immaculate savior. He wants to be a better person. He's painfully aware of his transgressions, and he wants to be able to discharge his duty with honesty and propriety. So I think you get sense from this kind of diary entry that this confident, sometimes even pompous image of himself that he projected for the outside world masked insecurities inside. If you read the book as well, there's some discussion in there about other evidence that there were some secrets in his life. These transgressions may have been specific kinds of activities that he was trying to keep secret. There's also a fair bit of material about his relationship with his father, tensions in that relationship, which again, just all kind of combined to help us understand who he was and why he behaved the way he did. The second quotation I included here because I think it captures so well his fatalism. He sets himself up for loss oftentimes, and it's not surprising because he did deal with a lot of loss in his life. He lost his first wife. She died after less than 2 years of marriage. She died giving birth to their first child, who unfortunately died that same day as well. He lost at least one other baby through miscarriage. He lost another child, Sally, at the age of 3. So, like most people in the 19th century, he's very familiar with the death of children, the death of loved ones, often long before their time. And so I think that feeds into his outlook on life as well. Meanwhile, though, while all of this is going on at home, his political career was developing too, particularly in the 1850s. And in 1853, he was elected to the US House. Off he went to Washington, D.C. And honestly, he didn't make that much of a mark there. He was there for about 3 years. And the one thing I would say is that he gained a reputation which may surprise you, given what you know about him already. He gained a reputation as a political moderate, at least relative to the other South Carolina congressmen. And of course, they always had the reputation at this time for being the most radical Southern extremists. And so maybe being a moderate by South Carolina standards was not that moderate, but still very worthy of note. And in fact, there were a couple of occasions where people back at home in Edgefield criticized Preston Brooks for being too moderate. They called it being too national. He wasn't as extreme about protecting the interests of South Carolina, the South in general. He was too interested in compromising with Northern congressmen. So that's the reputation he developed in the mid 1850s in Washington, D.C. And so again, that doesn't really fit with the image of the man behind the cane or the guy who dueled Louis Wigfall or this kind of thing. But if you think about the details of everything he's been through before, especially with that personal insult against a family member, it kind of slots into place that even though he wasn't always this violent actor in Washington, D.C., if the right buttons were pushed, then he was in a position to become the man behind the cane. So in 1856, in a sense, he got what he had been looking for quite some time now. He got that opportunity to achieve a heroic reputation based on the use of violence, a kind of manly display of energy to punish wrongdoers who had insulted his family. And after the caning, there were lots of signs that he embraced that role. He became more radical in terms of the politics of slavery and became more open to secession, began talking about disunion from the United States, which he hadn't really done before. So he seemed well on his way to becoming a secessionist, a leading fire eater. But on the other hand, again, in the book, there's more details, but you can find some evidence. It's mostly sort of hearsay type evidence, honestly, but still fairly credible, I think, that Brooks was not completely proud of what he'd done in May 1856, and that he regretted on some level losing control, which I think is what he did that day. He didn't necessarily go into the attack wanting to almost kill Sumner. He wanted to inflict a punishment. I think his emotions got the better of him and he lost control that day. But even though we'll never really find out, the full story of how he felt about his act in the caning, there's certainly lots of evidence on both sides that he, enjoyed being in the limelight to some degree, but possibly had some misgivings at the same time. Preston Brooks ended up dying fairly soon after the caning, only 8 months after, in January 1857. And this is where the story gets really ironic because, people often they assume Preston Brooks would have gone on to become a Confederate general, fought in the Civil War, all this kind of thing. But in fact, he did not. And Brooks himself presumably would have wanted a heroic death. We've talked about that image of his brother giving the ultimate sacrifice on the battlefields of Mexico. But instead of that kind of heroic death, Preston Brooks died a really sad, I think, pathetic death of some sort of throat virus, which killed him in the course of just a few days and caused him to asphyxiate in his Washington hotel room. So, again, a kind of ironic end to the story of this man. All right, so last part of the talk this evening is linking this to the big picture because I really do think that the story of Preston Brooks and the story of the caning can really help us better understand that tiny little question of why the Civil War happened when it did and how it did as well. One of the big themes here is failure. And this is true on a number of levels. First of all, on the personal level, I've already talked about how you can understand Preston Brooks, his psychology, his emotions. He's a guy who is keenly aware that he has failed at points in the past to do what he felt he ought to do. And he was certainly motivated to cane Charles Sumner and then to become radicalized and start supporting secession after the caning as well. But the bigger point, and this to me is where it gets really interesting, is that the region as a whole, the South, or at least its slaveholding leaders, made a series of errors that ultimately triggered the conflict that destroyed them. So again, more irony in this story. And the caning, honestly, is exhibit A here. If you think about the caning in the short term, it might seem like a triumph. It's this grand demonstration of Southern power. Brooks bests his enemy, Charles Sumner, with this physical attack. So in the short term, it seems like a success, a demonstration of Southern power. But fairly quickly, it ended up driving Northerners and Southerners further apart. It made Northerners more likely to want to fight back against the South. And maybe most importantly of all, it galvanized the ascent of the Republican Party, which was very new at this point in 1856, in national politics. And the Republican Party did not win the presidential election of 1856, but it did a lot better than it otherwise would have done thanks to Brooks's action. The Republican Party and its politicians used the caning as propaganda quite effectively in 1856. So it helps the Republican Party grow in 1856, even though it doesn't win. That kind of paves the way toward 1860 and Abraham Lincoln, secession, and from there, war. And what I suggest is that this was just the latest similar kind of Pyrrhic victory on the part of slaveholders. Fairly regularly, they tried to quench opposition to slavery, often with violence. But in fact, what happened is they ended up fueling the abolitionist fire instead. And those of you who are familiar with pre-Civil War history will probably already be thinking about the gag rules in the 1830s and 40s, or the repression of abolitionist mail in the mid 1830s, or the fugitive slave law of 1850. In all these cases, you see a similar pattern. Slaveholders, they're anxious, they're fearful about the security of slavery because basically they know enslaved people don't want to be enslaved. And so slaveholders are constantly worried about some kind of violent resistance. And when they sense these threats, they tend to overplay their hands. They take counterproductive actions which abridge the freedoms of white people in the United States as well as black people, which in turn inspires resistance to them on the part of white Northerners. Um, and those of you who are well read in this area, you'll probably be thinking about other books in the field. These general themes have been explored by other historians. But what I think I add to the conversation by focusing on Brooks and the caning is really a couple of things. One is to bridge the big picture of political culture with the individual psychology, the emotions, the experiences of failure. And I think bridging those two things really helps us understand them better. But second, the focus on Brooks and the caning also reveals the huge importance of disputes around physical violence in this whole dispute between the North and the South around slavery. And what Americans were doing really in the run up to the Civil War, and particularly after incidents like the caning, or you could throw John Brown's raid and other examples in there. Basically, what Americans are doing is they're arguing over some really basic questions about violence. So questions like who gets to inflict violence upon whom? With what kinds of weapons can they do that? In what contexts or locations is it okay to use violence? And if you look at pretty much any society, around the world, any point in world history, you're probably going to find that a given society answers those questions in its own distinctive ways. And that leads scholars to talk about different cultures of violence in different times and places. But in the United States, before the Civil War, even within this one country, there are multiple cultures of violence, if you will, emerging around the fight over slavery. And, think about the different answers to those questions about violence that you'd hear from slaveholders versus abolitionists versus congressmen. This is a really important part of the process that takes Americans further towards civil war. And these three books are just three of quite a number of books on the topic that I would recommend for anyone wanting to read more about these different ideas about the concept of violence and when it's justified. But there's one more layer to this. It's not just about violence, this big conversation that the caning energizes. It's also about free speech. And in a way, it's similar kinds of questions that Americans are asking about speech. Who gets to say what to whom? And that is a really important question in American history, and never more important than in the decades leading to the Civil War, when Americans are arguing so strenuously over the slavery issue. And they're starting to answer those questions about free speech very differently as well. And this opposition really comes through from there are two very famous images of the caning. You've seen them both already. This is by John McGee. You can see the headline, Argument versus Clubs. You can see Brooks is holding his cane, Sumner's holding his pen, and a rolled up sheet of paper with a speech on it. Similar kind of message from Homer Winslow's lithograph about the caning. And this one is headlined up above by a quotation from Henry Ward Beecher. He was a Northern minister. And the quotation is, in case you can't read it, the symbol of the North is the pen, the symbol of the South is the bludgeon. And again, the visual cues, Brooks, of course, holding his stick, Sumner holding his pen in the act of writing. The message is very clear that it's a disagreement over the proper relationship between language and violence. And this became one of the really big themes of the book as I was doing the research and really thinking about what the caning can do in helping us understand the bigger picture of Civil War history. People who are supporting Charles Sumner, most of them in the North, they're rallying around that symbol of the pen, the verbal argument, the free speech to oppose slavery, to say what they wanted to say. And so it's no accident that the slogan of the new Republican Party, which again, is greatly energized by the caning, the slogan of the new party, it takes kind of different variations, but basically free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. The right to speak out against slavery is an important part of what they're trying to protect. On the other side, Brooks's supporters in the South are arguing that there are actually some things you cannot say, that free speech does have limits. It's not an absolute right. And of course, the number one example of that for slaveholders is when it comes to our right to enslave people, our enemies don't get to comment on the injustice or the brutality of slavery. So they do not see abolitionist talk as being free speech. And in fact, even more than that, they see it as being tantamount to physical violence. And the logic here is that abolitionist talk can inspire enslaved people to resist slavery physically. And so therefore, there's not much of a gap between abolitionist language and anti-slavery rebellious violence. And you can see that in some of the responses to the caning. This quotation about combining freedom of speech and freedom of the cudgel, with the two kind of flowing together, part of the same continuum. That one came actually from Lawrence Kitt, Brooks's friend who I mentioned earlier. Other supporters used phrases like arguments stronger than words. So again, there's this kind of slippage between what we often think of as a sharp divide between words and violence. These are kind of flowing together in the minds of Southern slaveholders, and you really see that in the aftermath of the caning and the way people respond. And the important thing here is that this theme really benefits from the biographical sections of the book as well, because I think there's no better guide to these questions of free speech and violence than a man like Preston Brooks, who had been struggling with that relationship between free speech and violence his whole life. Because long before the caning, he had been raised in a society where it was really important to know whether words like coward or liar should require one to participate in a duel or take some other kind of physical action. And these affairs of honor, we think of affairs of honor in the South as being about the duel, about the kind of physical act of dueling. Um, but really, if you study them, they're much more about language than physical action. They're often caused by intemperate language, again, those keywords like coward or liar, that kind of thing. And affairs of honor are typically resolved not by two guys shooting at each other and hurting each other, but instead they're typically resolved by really carefully composed letters back and forth, um, trying to work out the conflict in a way that avoids physical violence. And in those letters back and forth, absolute precision of language was vital. And so, again, this is a theme that stretches back to Preston Brooks's childhood, his upbringing, learning about violence and honor and manhood in South Carolina, and then the caning and its aftermath. This theme really brings those periods together. All right, I'm almost done. Just a few closing thoughts, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and comments. Um, just a quick reflection on the kind of book I wrote. It is partly a biography, so if you read the book, you'll learn a lot about Preston Brooks. But it's also, as I've alluded to, it's also a history of ideas about manhood and honor being more fluid than we traditionally thought they were in the pre-Civil War South. Um, it is a history of how people thought about and justified violence in the context of the politics of slavery in antebellum America. But also, as my last point suggested, it's a history of where people place the line between words and violence, or how they think about the proper relationship between those two types of activity. And along the way, I've been working on this book a really long time. The book became more timely, sadly, more relevant in a new age of polarization and political violence. And when I first started this book, I would tell people what I was working on, the caning incident. And honestly, people would often react with a smirk. It seemed like a funny thing. And I think that was because it seemed so unthinkable in our own time that, an attack on a congressman, a physical assault on a congressman of this severity could be even remotely acceptable. It was, sealed off in the distant past. It couldn't happen again, is what I think most people thought, and therefore it seemed quaintly humorous. But then over the last few years, as I've been working on writing the book, of course, it's become less and less funny, less and less unthinkable. And that's exactly why I think we need to work harder to understand the man behind the cane and others like him. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul, for that deep dive into the book. We'll take some questions here, and just as a reminder, you can use the Q&A box to ask any questions about the man behind the cane and the course of the research. We have a few excellent questions already pouring in. A couple from Niels, some great questions here. I'd like to start with his question, which kind of unpacks some of the motivations around the caning, and as your book kind of outlines the dueling culture that is behind this and the customs of honor. So Niels asked, since some Northern politicians felt that Sumner had gone too far with the remarks in his speech, do you think there would not have been a strong an effect on sectional polarization if Brooks had either challenged Sumner to a duel or had done nothing?
Yeah, I think the reaction would certainly have been different, and even in the South, a lot of people wished that Brooks had done things differently, even if he'd punished Sumner in some way. The question of the duel. So obviously, I talked a bit about a previous duel Preston Brooks had fought, and so people sometimes ask why didn't Brooks challenge Charles Sumner to a duel? And the most important answer is that dueling was supposed to be between social equals. So you would never challenge someone to a duel unless you thought they were your social equal. And Preston Brooks definitely did not think that Sumner was his equal. But Sumner would have certainly said no anyway. He was a pacifist, and dueling was relatively rare in the northern states anyway. So a duel wouldn't have been possible, but another kind of attack is very imaginable. As I mentioned, the original plan was to grab Sumner outside the Capitol building, and who knows what that attack would have looked like, but it I think would have landed differently. One thing that many people complained about, especially in the North, but even among some white Southern slaveholders, they complained about the location of this. It's like the Capitol, the Senate chamber. This is a sacred space in American politics. How could you despoil that? So I think different location, different kind of attack, certainly would have landed differently in many quarters.
Excellent. And this is such an important book for right now with a lot of good food for thought. It's definitely a page turner as well. But I think there's some natural comparisons that a few people are asking about our current political moment and how this might inform our thinking about that. So Philip asked, so excited to read the book. Congratulations, Paul. How do you think antebellum political violence compares to the types and degree of political violence we're seeing today in the U.S.?
I think political violence always takes different forms in different times and places. So I don't think you're ever going to get, the same situation. The issues are different, the personalities are different. But for me, the really disturbing thing that brings the 1850s and our own time together is the idea that political violence might become normalized and just seem like an acceptable way to conduct politics. Um, and, we're seeing some signs of that today, just as we saw them in the 1850s. And so the way leaders respond to political violence, I think, is absolutely crucial.
Excellent. So we have a few questions as well about sort of the next generation and thinking about the longer scope of this. As you outlined, of course, Preston Brooks died in 1857, so we'll never really know how he may have responded to the crisis of disunion and secession and the Civil War. But a few people asked about maybe his children or people in his family and what their response to the Civil War was, and maybe how we can see how Preston Brooks may have responded through the actions of his family at the time.
Yeah, there were some strong reactions from his family, mostly support, but Preston Brooks, there's some interesting correspondence that I use in the book toward this theme I mentioned of him having kind of misgivings or at least anxiety about what he'd done. And so there's one letter he wrote to his younger brother in which Preston Brooks complained basically that he wasn't getting enough positive support from his close family members, even though, from what I've been able to tell, they were very supportive, but he was kind of anxious about that. And then there are some other sort of post-war examples where Preston Brooks's brother, the same younger brother, he was known as Ham, came out in the late 19th century in defense of Preston Brooks and the caning in the context of, the battles over history during the Lost Cause era. Ham Brooks wrote a couple of newspaper articles defending what his brother had done and expressing the wish that young Southern generations would be brought up revering people like Preston Brooks as well as the Confederate heroes. So support for sure among his family. One of the most sort of sobering examples of that, though, comes from Preston Brooks's son, who was at the time known as Robbie, who I think was 3 years old in 1856, and reportedly was engaged in a conversation with someone in his home about the attack. And somebody had given the impression that maybe Preston Brooks had lost the fight or something like that. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but the quotation that I've got from a family member who reported this is this 3-year-old guy saying, "No, my father knocky him." In other words, Sumner, in other words, my dad beat Sumner up. And it sounded like it was being expressed with some pride. And so, yeah, again, kind of a sobering example of support from the family.
Fascinating stuff. We have another question from Miles Abernethy, who says, "Congratulations on the new book." A couple of questions, but I'll skip ahead to this part about Brooks's legacy. So Miles asked, "Did any post-war individuals in the South blame Brooks for inflaming the pre-war violence?"
Um, I have not come across any examples of that in particular. And in fact, when I started serious research on the book, I always thought I would do a really long, substantive chapter on the changing memories of Preston Brooks, over the last 170 years. Um, but I was surprised actually that there was some stuff. Preston Brooks obviously has been a figure in American history and has been remembered, but he's not been contested in the same way that many other figures from the Civil War era have been. So I found that I had enough material to write a sort of breezy epilogue, but not a full chapter on the memories of Preston Brooks. And certainly don't remember coming across any cases where he was blamed in that way for doing what I'm saying in my book he did, aggravate the sectional conflict.
Very interesting. We have another material culture question, which is interesting. This didn't occur to me, but I like this question from Glenn, who asked, "Does Brooks's cane still exist?" So could you tell us the fate of the behind the cane?
Well, I cannot tell you with confidence or certainty, but I can point you in the direction of a really terrific article that was written by Michael Woods, who's another Civil War era historian, on this very topic, like what happened to the cane. And what Woods concluded is that it's not really certain what happened to it, other than first of all, one certainty is that it was shattered into fragments on the day of the assault. That's how brutal it was. The cane was in pieces. And then there is reportedly a cane that people say is the cane in a museum in Boston, and it's been there for many years. And Woods concludes that it's possible that that was the actual cane that had been repaired, but by no means certain. And the other piece of this is that there were souvenirs purporting to be made from the original cane. Like I've seen in a museum in South Carolina, a couple of rings, one ring made out of the wood from a cane, supposedly the cane, and then another made out of gold because the cane was gold tipped. So there are two rings in this museum, and there are other examples like that of souvenirs that people claimed were made from the canes. And then the other piece of that story as well is that Brooks was sent many, many replacement canes by supporters in the South. And this was typically done, at community meetings. People would get together, they would express support for what Brooks had done in written resolutions, and then they would decide, and our community is going to send him a cane. Sometimes those canes bore messages of further violence, like, for example, hit him again, which is pretty unmistakable in terms of if these abolitionists keep talking out against slavery, we're going to keep doing what Preston Brooks did.
Great. So another question sort of about print culture and thinking about the issues of free speech and polarization that you kind of tease out throughout the chapters. But Kathleen asked, how did the newspapers at the time report on the caning?
They reported in very different ways, and I think that's what you would expect. And the easy story to tell about reports of the caning is that, northern newspapers came out against Brooks, and, in sympathy for Sumner, southern newspapers came out in favor of Brooks and supported the caning. And that's by and large true. But for me, it was also very interesting to note the significant exceptions to that general rule. And so in the South, for example, there were quite a number of newspapers who expressed misgivings about the caning, about what Brooks had done, especially like if they're up in the border South or if they're in a city or this kind of thing, they're likely to be less committed to the slaveholding regime. And in the North too, you see some ambivalence because Sumner is this super radical abolitionist who by no means has complete support from the Northern population. And so you see some misgivings where, for example, a fairly common sentiment in the North is we do not want to give Charles Sumner the time of day, but we also believe that a senator should be able to say what he wants in a Senate speech without fear of physical reprisal. So the newspapers are reporting the actual incident according to their biases and preconceptions, and then they're following up with commentary, sometimes pretty extensive commentary reflecting that as well.
Very good. So we have a question about Brooks's wingman, as this commenter describes him, from Kenneth No, who asked, as you know, Henry Edmondson, Brooks's wingman, was from Montgomery County, born in Blacksburg, and lived in Shawsville. How do you treat his participation in the book?
Yeah, I always hope to find out more about Henry Alonzo Edmondson, and then the other Southern congressman with a claim to being Brooks's wingman of sorts was Lawrence Kit, who I mentioned too. And same kind of thing there. They didn't end up being super important actors in the story. They certainly played important brief roles in terms of giving Brooks support, and there's some evidence that Brooks strategized with them between the Sumner speech and the caning on May 22nd. But yeah, for the most part, Edmondson appears just on the mornings of May 21st and May 22nd because he's the guy who stands outside the Capitol with Brooks. And he gives Brooks some good advice. For example, at one point, Brooks and Edmondson are sort of discussing the attack and how it might go down if Sumner arrived outside the Capitol. And Edmondson commented and gave Brooks some good advice, even to the point of observing that one scenario that Brooks imagined is that Sumner would be going up this set of steps and Brooks would have to dash around the corner and run up after him. And Edmondson pointed out, aren't you worried that by the time you get to the top of the stairs, you're going to be out of breath and he's going to beat you in whatever kind of conflict you have? So he's clearly thinking through things with Brooks and right to the afternoon of the attack. But other than that, doesn't play much of a role in the book, really. But yeah, it's a nice local connection with Montgomery County.
A different local connection. We have a question from one of our colleagues here. So Melanie asked, given your comment on how long you've been working on the book, would you recommend that other historians dedicate their time to similar or even lesser known figures? Why or why not?
Hmm. Yeah, I think for me anyway, Brooks was the right scope of project. Because, when you think about writing a biographical book of one kind, whether it's pure biography or historical or cultural biography or whatever, um, people often think first of the presidents and the big names and the people who already have a bunch of biographies about them. And that never really appealed to me much. But nor did I think, have the confidence to write a book about somebody no one had ever heard of, and never did anything that people tend to mention in the history lectures and the history textbooks. So for me, Brooks was a kind of sweet spot where he was somewhat familiar. People know about the incident, even if they don't know much else about him. And so that provided me just with sort of the entree, if you like, of being able to say to people, this is what I'm writing about, but I'm digging deeper and taking it in these other directions. So I'm fairly happy with the way it worked out. Yeah.
Excellent. I think it's you are to be commended for shedding new light on this major event that most of us, of course, know very little about Preston Brooks and some of the more complex motivations behind this critical event. A few people asked about some presidential history adjacent questions. Larry Silver asked, did the president respond to the incident? And then also Jacob asked about the 1856 presidential election, of course. So do you have any thoughts on
hmm
maybe how Brooks did shape the bigger and better known figures at the time?
Yeah, I did not come across any real presidential commentary on this. There must have been, but it just didn't make it into the papers or whatever. Um, but I did definitely find a huge connection with the presidential election of 1856. And so a big part of the final chapter of the book is looking at the political consequences of the caning. And, I alluded a little bit to this in the talk. But in 1856, it's a presidential election year. The caning happens in May. The election is going to be November. So it's perfectly timed to have maximum impact on people's choices in 1856. And of course, the Republican Party is the young, new upstart party. They're already doing fairly well in Congress at this point in 1856. But they've only really existed for 2 years, and so the idea of them capturing the White House is pretty unheard of. But the caning really does give them a lot of propaganda, and John C. Fremont is the presidential candidate. Don't remember much of him specifically speaking about the caning, but it was more the Republican political operatives working on his behalf who described the caning, very explicitly in terms of the caning won X thousand votes for the Republican Party. Just a guess, but it still gives you an idea of how important they thought it was for the Republican Party in 1856.
And you, of course, mentioned that Brooks was not a fan of Fremont, right? I mean, for the rest of his life, as short as it was, he was definitely vocal in that moment. Um, we
Yeah.
have some related questions. You alluded earlier to the excerpts from the diary, which is really fascinating, sort of glimpse at the sort of inner psyche going on here in the Brooks family. But Trey Wellborn asked an adjacent question when Brooks was talking about some admission of possible sins and what those might be. So you had to kind of read between the lines about those. Uh, but Trey Wellborn asked, were you able to uncover any additional primary evidence that Brooks and Keat especially used alcohol to embolden themselves for the caning of Sumner? Or
No.
in other ways, what's the context of maybe alcohol consumption that may have influenced this?
Yeah, I think it was involved, and almost certainly was, but there's no kind of smoking gun evidence like a receipt from the liquor store or something like that. There are mentions of it, that Brooks was and he was under so much stress. There was definitely some drinking in his background as well. So it makes perfect sense that in these couple of days, it must have been a long 2 days for Brooks because he's really anxious about how this is going to play out. And there's some circumstantial evidence that he was drinking a lot to relieve the stress. But of course, that usually backfires when you try and use alcohol in that way.
Excellent. We have another question, some more excellent questions pouring in here. I like this question from Shaylin, I think it is, who asked, in the course of your research, what surprised you most about Preston Brooks?
Um, that is a great question. I have to give a little bit of thought to that. I think probably the things that surprised me most were the glimpses into Brooks as a political moderate, which I mentioned a bit, and B, a nice guy, which, people even on the other side of the political aisle described, and C, a really tender parent, and that was evident in those same extracts from his diary that his widow copied out after his death. There are just some really touching moments of him, talking about his relationship with his kids. There was one episode where one of his young kids wandered off and was lost for a couple of hours, and he describes his torment and distress during that period. And so, it shouldn't surprise you because he's just a guy. He's not always this ferocious bully. But, given his reputation, I think those are the moments when I kind of felt like, oh, yeah, this is a person I'm dealing with rather than just the caricature. And that was incredibly helpful in writing the book.
Yeah, you bring out some really fascinating details over the course of the book. If I can, my favorite chapter was the one on Mexico, and that's what surprised me the most. That, thinking about this long Civil War era framing, I think most of us want to jump ahead of the Civil War to understand how Brooks impacted that. But you kind of argue that, what he did in 1856 is very much shaped by his earlier action and lack thereof in Mexico.
Yeah.
So we have another question with a connection to our modern political moment. Corinne asked, we saw the focus on manhood and protecting honor as a contributing factor towards violence during the caning. What sorts of characteristics did you associate with violence, now considering the shifting ideas of masculinity and toxic masculinity?
So the question is about the present day, is that right?
Right.
So yeah, I think the relationship between violence and toxic masculinity is very, very strong today, and I think it does harken back to the 1830s, 40s, and 50s in many ways. I think that there are always different definitions of manhood and what a man ought to do and how he ought to behave. So it's not the case that in every time and place, every guy is defining manhood as the ability to inflict violence on someone else. But that's certainly been a constant theme, and it sometimes rises to the surface, I think, in certain contexts, and that was the case in the 1850s as well as today.
A related question about the scope of the book. And of course, as we mentioned, Brooks died shortly after the caning incident. Um, but Owen O'Toole asked about the scope and the setting of the book. Is it primarily pre-Civil War, or does it also include parts of the Civil War and later history?
Yeah, it's almost entirely pre-Civil War. And in fact, there's really nothing about the Civil War years themselves, because I think because by then so many other incidents and emotions had overtaken what happened in 1856. Americans weren't talking about the caning because they had they had violence going on at a much larger scale in front of their eyes. So there's really nothing about the Civil War years. What I do is there are 5 chapters in the book, and by the end of chapter 5, we've got to 1860 and 61 with the election of Lincoln, and just kind of reflecting on how that tied up the some of the storylines that Brooks was involved with. And then there's an epilogue, which looks kind of high level look at the different ways that Brooks has been remembered. And as I mentioned before, there isn't that much material in that epilogue, but there's enough to kind of trace a change in reputation. Brooks being fought over, his memory being contested at different times and places. And then I take it actually all the way up to our lifetimes, basically. For example, the caning was invoked during the impeachment of Bill Clinton, one of the senators in charge of the proceedings. It kind of invoked Brooks's legacy there because the proceedings were in the old Senate chamber. So this guy asked the question, which America are we going to be during these proceedings? Are we going to be the ones who negotiated the Compromise of 1850, harkening back to that? Or are we basically going to be the ones who cane each other? And I don't think he was suggesting that they would actually physically fight, but his point was, are we going to be at each other's throats or not? So there have been a few recent references to Brooks and the caning as well.
Excellent. And just as a final reminder, we have time for maybe one or two short questions. So send those in if you'd like to ask a question you haven't done so already. I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about your process through this topic. You almost encountered this by accident in some ways, right? And you ended up retracing some of these steps to try to do a deeper dive in the history.
Yeah. I first encountered the Preston Brooks papers actually when I was doing research for my first book, which was about Southern identity and nationalism before and during the Civil War. So I used the Brooks papers a little bit, and I talked about Brooks as a sort of prototypical martyr for the Southern cause before the Civil War even broke out. And I always remember thinking, this is someone it would be interesting to go back to in some way. And particularly part of that collection of Preston Brooks papers that I looked at um, while doing the first book, and certainly again while doing the second, was a scrapbook of newspaper clippings, which was compiled by his widow, so similar to the extracts from the diary. And just the knowledge that somebody would take the time to do that kind of thing for this guy who I only knew as having carried out this despicable act. I think that sort of got me intrigued. And so I always thought in the back of my mind, maybe Preston Brooks could be a good subject for a book someday.
Excellent. So we have another question, actually about Stephen Douglas, who I believe is pictured in some versions of the political cartoons depicting the caning. But Glenn asks, given that Stephen Douglas was a witness to the caning, did it come up in the 1860 election debates? Did Douglas talk about the caning?
I don't think so. Not that I ever saw. Yeah, I mean, Douglas was also a target of Charles Sumner's anger in the original speech as well. So alongside Andrew P. Butler, Stephen Douglas was singled out. So he was one of the targets of Sumner and the abolitionists in general. But I don't recall anyway Douglas making much of that and really talking up his connection to the caning. In a way, I do think he sympathized with what Brooks did on some level, but probably didn't want to associate himself with it too overtly.
So a final brief question. A few people have asked about this, but I think you knew it was coming. Where can we find the book, and can we possibly get any autographed copies? Where are we going to see you around, maybe?
Yeah, so the question of where to get the book from, anywhere fine books are sold, as the old saying goes. So the usual places, I always recommend your local independent bookstore as being the best place to buy any book. They will happily order it in for you. And you can get it from the usual online retailers as well. For those of you in Blacksburg, I think there are a few of you out there. The Virginia Tech University bookstore, which sells far more sweatshirts than it does books. They actually have copies in stock, so that would be another place to get the books from. And if you're local to the area, of course, I would be more than happy to meet up and sign some books for you.
Excellent. The book is The Man Behind the King. The author is Dr. Paul Quigley. We're very proud of him. Congratulations on the new book. We're very excited for it. We'd like to also thank all of our center donors and thank all of you for attending this evening. We hope to see you around at future Civil War Center events here at Virginia Tech. And thanks once more to Dr. Quigley for giving us such an excellent deep dive into his new book. Thank you and good night.
Thanks very much for hosting, and thanks everyone for attending. Good night.